Oh, we're live. Good. Hi. So nice to see all of you here again. So this talk will be a bit about Wittgenstein, and it will be about nonsense as such. So I'm going to try to hide this. Just a second. Anyway, the first part of this talk will be a little bit philosophical. And then the next part will be a little bit more practical. In the chat, I put up something of a Menti. So if you have time and if you can multitask, then please go and write something in that part. But before we begin, maybe just a little bit about me. So this kind of messy picture is part of different sides of me. So I grew up with a Commodore 64, the Muppet Show, and role-playing games. So I kind of guess that makes me a nerd. It also makes me very old, I guess. Some hobbies I have is to go to football games. I love going to football games to sing and actually scream. I also like Scrum and Agile principles a lot. I'm an editor at the series Scrum, which is the largest community for Scrum at Medium. Mostly write about my failures. I also, as a hobby project, I'm trying to create a framework which is kind of a combination of role-playing games and the agile principles. At work, I help to collect tax information from other countries. Right now, we're putting structure to the data. The next step is to add some business intelligence and add some machine learning to the data. And the purpose is kind of to prevent aggressive tax planning, withholding money, and stuff like that. Anyway, this talk will be about how Wittgenstein's philosophies can be used when creating software. So we will talk about the matrix. We will talk about programming, communication, and finally, we will talk about the 6 principles of nonsense. But most of all, we will actually tackle how communication is done. So the first part is very philosophical, and as I said, then we will end up with some practical tips. Wittgenstein is complicated in the sense that he's actually the only famous philosopher who invented 2 very different philosophies during his lifetime. Both of the philosophies focus very much on language. And to not make life very confusing, I will refer to the younger Wittgenstein and the older Wittgenstein. And the younger Wittgenstein meant that the limit of our focus is our language. We cannot think of things that are not in our language. We cannot think the unthinkable. And if this sounds very confusing, I completely agree, but we will dive more into what this means. The quote that you see on the page, on the other hand, is from the older Wittgenstein. And he said, creating and understanding philosophy is more about avoiding misunderstandings and understanding each other better. It's a little bit like therapy. So a little bit based on a preference and how well I can explain this, this session might either be very much about nonsense or maybe therapy in some sense. But first, it might be good to have some idea of who Wittgenstein was and put it into context and history. So Wittgenstein, he was active during the first half of the 20th century. He started out as an engineer. He was very interested in mathematics, and he had a specific interest in languages, especially around what function that language fills and the logical principles. For example, Wittgenstein is considered to have invented the truth tables, something that any program have used. He was active at Cambridge, and he discussed mathematics with Bertrand Russell. And Russell could actually never really decide if Wittgenstein was a madman or not. But then he saw the first line in Wittgenstein's only published book, which is the Tractatus. It's very thin, it's not very big. And after reading the first sentence, he decided Wittgenstein was a genius. And that line was, "The word is everything that is the case." Yeah. But basically what I think he means is that all we can talk about is what exists in this word. There is no point talking about things outside our language that we cannot refer to. That means things such as God, moral, or feelings, for example, or unicorns. They might exist, but they're not useful to talk about. So younger Wittgenstein, he spent most of his time breaking down language into syntax, researching how different parts of language relate to each other. Wittgenstein meant that there are exact rules of our language, and the combination of the words, how we combine them, form a specific meaning. And he tried to discover these rules. If you think about this is very similar to programming. In programming, when we do programming, we combine syntax to create clear instructions for a compiler. And if you look at this page on the right side, you can see it kind of looks like old basic programming, for those of you who remember that, with line numbers, things like 10 print Fredrik, 20 go to Fredrik, 20 go to 10, and so on. But it's not applying clean code, not at all, not as per Robert Martin would say. But with complicated code, if you stare at it long enough, eventually you begin to grasp some parts of it, some things you would probably never understand at all. So Wittgenstein was very interested in the relationship between mathematics and reality. He thought, is mathematics something humans have invented, or is reality based on mathematics? That is, have we invented mathematics, or does it exist regardless of whether we as humans exist? And you can see, you have this picture from The Matrix, and it's one of my favorite movies, and I get most of all of you probably have seen it. And he meets this boy who can, bend a spoon. And the boy tells Nemo, do not try and bend the spoon. That's impossible. Instead, realize the truth. And Nemo says, what truth? There is no spoon. Now, younger Wittgenstein would not agree that there is no spoon. He would argue that to define an object, we need to find the minimum requirements for something to be a spoon, the minimum necessary attributes of a spoon to uniquely identify it. So, what is then sufficient to define a spoon? Luckily, we are programmers, and most of us are it, so it's easier for us to understand Wittgenstein. Because basically, if you look at this class declaration on the right side, and never mind, the errors in the syntax and so on, if we create a new instance of this class, it will be of the class spoon, and it will have the attributes and the properties that we assign to it. We will know it's a spoon. We can reference to it as a spoon and nothing else. So basically, what Wittgenstein tries to do is simple object-oriented programming. And Wittgenstein would say, programming is useful because syntax can be defined sufficiently to understand the purpose exactly. And when compiled, we will get the same result every time. So it's a perfect match between the language and our word. And this is what Wittgenstein wanted to discover, but for the language we use in our world, so to say. So younger Wittgenstein basically had two premises that he said. The structure of reality determines the structure of the language, and that reality is based on mathematics. And in some sense, this is kind of logical. You see mathematics all over the place in nature. You have the golden spiral, also known as the Fibonacci sequence. It's a mathematical pattern, and you find it in flowers, you find it in weather patterns, you find it in animal horns, and so on. And most likely, you have experienced it yourself in planning poker, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, and so on. Another example of how to explain what Wittgenstein says is made by Anthony Kenny. He compares it to chess. The chess pieces alone do not constitute the game. The arrangement and placement is what describes a specific chess game. Only by knowing the totality of facts with all the pieces in relation to each other can we understand the game. So language and how words relate to each other are the same thing. A single word doesn't give any understanding. Only together can they describe a picture of reality. Now, to understand this a little bit more, to understand what is true and what we can talk about, something that, which was very important to younger Wittgenstein, because he was an engineer and he loved mathematics. Everything had to be true or false. But anyway, let's look at this picture of pixels. It's pixel clear, right? Imagine this picture on a computer screen. It is built with pixels. You need to have structure to form a picture. A single pixel doesn't give you a picture that we can understand. Only put together in a non-random manner do they form a picture. It's the same thing with language. The combination of the words we use form a picture of the real world. So imagine here, we put random pixels on a screen. With this, we can create all possible combinations. The random combinations will create images of actually everything that has happened and everything that will happen. So one random image will be me, like that. Another one will show me on my deathbed, even though that has not happened yet. Even with a resolution as small as 1024 times 768, we can have good enough quality to randomize pictures to show everything that has happened and everything that actually will happen in the future. And if you just continue with this experiment of plotting random pixels, we might get a picture like this. As you can see, there are a lot of Disney characters on this page, but there is one element that doesn't really fit in. On the right side, you see Duffy. He's not from the Disney universe. So this picture is not true, despite having non-random structure. So Wittgenstein says for some items, we can't know whether it's true or not from language. We can talk about things that might or might not exist or be true, from his point of perspective, that is. And he means that those things are moral, dragons, or God. And Wittgenstein again starts by saying the word is everything that is the case. Meaning, we can only refer to things that exist in our world. He means don't waste time discussing what's not in our world. And furthermore, Wittgenstein also said, whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent. And I think that what younger Wittgenstein meant with this is useless to discuss something we can never prove to be false or true. We can talk about dragons, but why should we? The whole discussion would be nonsense. As we can never scientifically prove the point, it would be completely hypothetical. But compared to mathematics, where everything can be verified, or programming using a compiler. Now, that was the younger Wittgenstein. So shake your arms a little bit, clear your head. We have taken the red pill. Now we will try the blue pill. And by the time we start again, you will feel light as rain. So I have taken the blue pill now. So take some water. Now, good. Forget everything I told you. Now, the older, Wittgenstein, after fighting in World War I, he got some medals. He tried out an occupation as a junior school teacher in Austria. He was a terrible teacher. He thought all the kids were stupid, basically. He forms a new philosophy. And this kind of caused a riot because his old philosophy was very popular. It would be like Ken Schwaber, the founder of Scrum, saying he would go back to waterfall. It's a complete mess. But anyway, he says that now forget about the idea that language follows a structure that follows reality. The older Wittgenstein, he would basically say that there is no spoon. The concept of a spoon is something we as humans have invented. We use a word to describe some object, and then in a game, we agree that that object is called a spoon. Take pain. We cannot know how much of pain a person experiences firsthand. we actually have no clue of what's going on in another person's brain. We can relate to being in pain because we have experienced it though. But the meaning of the word pain is very different for each of us. So the rules for what a word means is based upon context. Let's take an example. A mom goes out with her 2-year-old kid. The mom sees a car, points at the car and says, car. Now, for the next 20 times, every time the kid sees a car, the kid will say, car, car, car. It's kind of to confirm that the rules of the games are understood. Now, what would happen if we had an evil mom, who would say, bike, pointing to a car? Or even worse, what if we had a configuration manager who actually compiles a product manually and moves the items manually from one place to another and says, this is DevOps, right? That will not be good. Anyway, to explain this, Wittgenstein has something he calls for family resemblance and language games to explain the theory. Basically, he means in a family, there's no one trait that can tell you if someone is a sibling or not. There are some resemblances. They can have the same nose, same eye color. They might all like ketchup, but it's the same thing with language. There is a resemblance in how words are put together, forming a meaning. But you can't point at any rules. There is no real logic in language. So you see, he completely turns around Wittgenstein here. But he means that the purpose of language is to avoid mistakes and misunderstandings. Our language is not exact enough for universal theory. The meaning gets lost outside of you. Therefore, philosophy is more of a therapy work for yourself. So, Ole Wittgenstein meant that meaningful statements do not come from mapping language to a logical word. In most cases, the meaning of a word is how we decide to use the word. So saying a sentence, everyone hears the same sentence. We interpret the meaning differently, however, and the interpretation is based on our experience and knowledge. My wife, she's a music teacher and language teacher. She turned a specialist pedagogue. She gave me a good example. So let's try this. Dun, 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 dun. Dun, dun, dun. I bet many of you in your head now, right now, you've got a picture of Star Wars. I didn't even say the name, but our experience and what we have experienced before can actually give us and convey some meaning, So we basically left Plato's idea word and we went into Aristotle's word of empirism here. So the meaning of a word is based on its usefulness in the context, not on a universal idea. Evil or bad as such doesn't exist. It's made up by us as humans. So the main points of the Ole Wittgenstein. Our understanding of what the word means is based upon what others have told us it means. Language is a tool to create a collective understanding. Language is not used to describe reality. Our reality is built from the meaning that we assign to words. Now, we invent words. We decide what the word represents, which can be very different from person to persons. In real life, IRL, that is, the meaning of a word is not universal. The same word can have a different meaning for you and me. We can right now decide that this is a grunge. However, when programming, syntax and language have exact definitions for everyone using the language. The software we compile will be the same for everyone. This has actually a drastic impact. For artificial intelligence and computers, word and syntax have an exact meaning. In software, the object spoon is always the same based upon our definitions. There is a superclass of the spoon, all other spoons inherit from. The meaning is not relative at all. So basically in program, we can sufficiently define exactly what makes a spoon and what does not make a spoon, and it will be the single truth as long as it compiles. It can be verified, in some sense. And in some other sense, if the artificial intelligence would be conscious, they would live in Plato's cave. They would see shadows of the real world. We would be the creators of that world, and the program would never see our interactions as creators directly. Because the AI can't see outside the program or the building blocks of the software. What the AI would experience is the result after we compile. So their word is based upon a combination of syntax and language that has predetermined an exact meaning. So what is right and wrong is what we decide it is. Even and bad is, basically properties that we have set. And for the future of artificial intelligence, this means what we feed into our machine learning is super important. Amazon, for example, they had to scrap a recruiting tool. They basically want to have an AI screening participants. And they discovered that they never got any female candidates. Why? Well, the AI was based upon statistics from the real world, and a very few women in the real world. So basically, AI disqualified all women. Not very good, right? Because we want to have lots of women in the tech business. Now, to take this to our reality then, Wittgenstein says that we cannot think outside our language. Language limits our thoughts. We cannot think the unthinkable. So if we cannot think outside our language, could we then be in a computer program that we can't see outside? What if someone programmed our word? So this is also another classical philosophy question. Descartes, he addressed it with, cogito ergo es, or rather, I think, therefore I am. He also assumed there must be a good God, so no demons tamper with our minds, but it's a completely different meaning anyway. Anyway, in the matrix, our reality is created from programming code. Code creates the word. That means that the structure of the word follows language. That is, the structure of language determines reality. And there's a very fun scene in the matrix where they eat food and they wonder if the creators got the taste of chicken correctly or not. Basically, how do we know that they actually know what chicken tastes like? Maybe they don't know it. Maybe that's why everything tastes like chicken. I think it's hilarious. I really laughed aloud when I saw the scene for the first time. Anyway, using the younger Wittgenstein's theory, we might very well live in the matrix. And this is interesting because as tech nerds, we live in the universe of both the younger Wittgenstein and the older Wittgenstein. When programming software, we can apply the younger Wittgenstein's theories, but when working in team, we can apply the older Wittgenstein's theories. So both of them are useful, but they work very differently. So now comes a little bit more of a therapy session then of how this can be used. So imagine knowledge as an onion. For each layer outwards, understanding is reduced. Furthest out are managers, who usually have no clue. Now take the word DevOps. It has existed for how long? 10 years, perhaps? The word DevOps symbolizes very many good practices, such as plan, do, check, act, continuous integration, culture, a lot of things, But the word is very complex, and it requires a deep understanding and experience. And as this word DevOps gained popularity, reaching beyond professionals and specialists, the concept had to be made easier to understand for the masses or for managers, It might be that you want to have DevOps in your organization, so you have to sell it to management. So an expert might, tell the pointy-haired boss, in 1 hour cell talk, oh, this DevOps is a great thing, the organization will be so efficient and productive, And based on this, the pointy-haired man says, go ahead and implement this DevOps thingy. Let's make it a project. You have 3 months. Now, that's not good. But using Wittgenstein's ideas and the onion, we can a little bit explain this behavior. The boss knowledge of DevOps is furthest out in the onion, very further out in the layer. He has very little knowledge, So that means he has to connect DevOps to some context that he understands very well. Project management. So he therefore concludes that DevOps is something implementable that you can put fixed scope and cost on. The thing is, you can't transfer the full meaning of many years of experience in the time people are usually willing to listen. You really have to be that person to understand the meaning entirely. Basically, I have to be you to understand you exactly. And you can sell something in minutes, but you should be very careful about the consequences. And basically, this also means, you communicate best with those at the same skill level who have the same experience, looking at the onion, who are at the same layer down. Otherwise, you would talk past each other. A quick example is, when I started my agile journey, I read a lot of good books, and I thought I understood the books. I could read the words, I thought I understood the sentences, but really, I didn't have the experience. It's not until later when I reread the books that I could actually understand what the author tried to convey the information and the experiences. Now, communication in a social context is very complex. It follows no typical cause and effect rules. There are no golden bullets. And we can't even create best practices that, because there is no causality. But if we could use younger Wittgenstein's ideas in programming, then the older Wittgenstein can actually then explain teamwork better. So let's talk about the 6th principle of nonsense. Probably heard of the concepts previously, but it's interesting that Wittgenstein's philosophy actually support the ideas. So without further ado, have some tips on how to work better in teams using the ideas, or using ideas supported from Wittgenstein. Now, first principle of nonsense. We need to unlearn together. Again, older Wittgenstein says that the meaning of a word is the use of it in language. We get the meaning of a word by defining it together. Wittgenstein calls this the language game. The meaning of the game is to have a common understanding. Then we can enjoy the game. If you think of Monopoly, every family has their own set of rules of how to play Monopoly. And then we meet another family, we try to play Monopoly. We get angry at each other because, no, free parking, that means I should get all the money. No, that's not how we do it in our family, and so on, So as with Monopoly, before playing, we need to understand the rules. And it's the same thing when forming a team. As in chess, we need to understand each other in relation to each other. So we need to unlearn what we have learned when forming new teams. We need to create a word together where we meet, talk, and form a new meaning of the words that we use. Then, we have at last a common meaning. And then we need another team. Then we have to sync with them. And maybe, just maybe, this can explain why scaling is so hard. How can you have thousands of people in the same company having the same idea and thoughts about what DevOps is, what is a Scrum Master, what is the role, what should that person be doing, Or how can management explain in half an hour the strategy they spent 6 months creating? Or how can you explain what DevOps is to a manager in half an hour? So in order to get this understanding, you need to do the classic form, storm, and norm plus perform to reach a common language in your group. A little bit, think of couples who have been married for 20 years. They can finish each other's sentences. They have gained the full understanding. Now, we don't want to have a Star Trek Borg, community or understanding. We don't need that. But we need to build common knowledge. And we get better as time passes and as we have worked together. Wittgenstein, he talks about a box with a beetle in. I have my personal box, and inside it is a beetle. But it's only me who can see the beetle. You also have a box with a beetle, but I can't see into your box. So maybe my beetle is something very different from your beetle. It's not until we open the box that we can see the difference. Maybe your beetle was a pen, maybe mine was a grunge. We'll never know until we open the box. So to avoid misunderstandings and share the same meaning, we need to create a collective word that is understood the same by all participants. And we can only do this by sharing experiences and working together, constantly communicating and rebuilding our definitions. So imagine having a team working on a new product. In the beginning, you will have very little domain knowledge. So you will need to have a very detailed discussion on requirements. It might sound something like the quote you can see on this slide. But after a year, you probably just need a Post-it, a one-liner. And, you might wonder, Why was that so hard to understand? But it's because we built some common meaning and understanding. So we need to create, find ways to communicate better and to get experiences. There are some very good practical tips on how to do this. Swarming, for example, when you have a problem, swarm together, bring together your competencies and solve the problem. Backlog refinement, if you do it together. Pair programming, those are all kind of things, that help us open the box. Now, Wittgenstein's theories can also be used to explain why we get more and more overhead the more people we add to our project or working on a product. The more people involved, the more information you need to convey to get a common picture. And you need to spend a lot of time keeping everyone up to date. A little bit like Conway's law, if you think about it. But as you see, we need to optimize the flow of communication. We need to move decision-making processes to the people closest to the work to avoid, handovers and delay and unnecessary communication, which is waste. So we need to find and figure out a sweet spot where we have enough information for everyone to be aligned, going in the same direction, and to take, good decisions, but it can't be overkill. We can't communicate too much either, because then we wouldn't be doing anything else. So maybe, just maybe, if you want to keep productivity, scaling is not effective. Maybe a trick is to keep products very small for a few teams to be able to handle it. In DevOps, we try to address this, basically. We try to have microservices, for example. That means you can take something from start to beginning, and you have independent teams who can work on the microservice. But now there is a challenge, not having more persons. The software business grows so complex. We discover new bottlenecks all the time. First we had a shift left movement. We had to integrate testing. We need to do testing earlier or continuously in the process to avoid rework and handovers. Then we need to move to production more and more often. So we need continuous integration and delivery. We will need DevSecOps, DevBizOps, DevXOps, and so on. But becoming more specialist and also adding more skills to a team is a challenge. We need to do this without growing the team too large. Because as we add people, we add more complexity, more overhead to our communication, the previous principle. HBR, Harvard Business Review, in an article, they say that the perfect team size is 4.6 team members. I wonder how they got the 0.6. Anyway, today it's very rare for a team to have that few members, and have all the necessary skills. You need back-end skills, front-end skills, testing skills, operation, pen testing, UX, CX, as we learned yesterday, requirements gathering, business knowledge, all of that. How can you get all of that into a small team of 4.6 people? So for a team to be self-managing and take something from idea to production, we want to avoid, queues, dependencies, handovers, partial work, task switching, and so on. We want to have one team being able to handle it all. But if we can't get all the skills into one team, what can we do? Well, the only thing we can do is to make the word easier and reduce the knowledge needed. To avoid waste and complex communication, we need to reduce complexity. And we need to reduce complexity to some simple rules or processes that everyone can understand and do without having the knowledge. That's exactly what we do when we automate, for security scans or create pipelines, continuous integration. We build knowledge into the process. The team doesn't need to have all the knowledge as long as automated routines are followed. The team can still be self-managing, and move something from idea to production. Automation, of course, also reduces, other things. That's other good things, shortening the lead and cycle time to move something to production and so on. The picture you see is basically how we try to look at the ISO certification we had, and then we wrote down all the rules, in order for security. And then we see how can we integrate, security into our existing Scrum processes and our pipeline in order to reach DevSecOps. And it, it's still at an experimentation stadium, but it's a little bit of the idea of how you can do it. Now, maybe I shorten this down a little bit. But anyway, the fifth principle of nonsense is feedback. Carleson, most of us like to explain what we mean, but we're not good at listening. So all the books tell us start listening, and all will be good. It's not that easy. Most of the time we believe what we say is crystal clear. It's clear to us, but it's not to other people, So maybe we should ask more questions instead and have quick communication feedback loops. As we probably can't automate communication, I doubt that will ever happen. We probably have to be better at this. A good example of how this can work is planning poker. You try to see what's the effort to complete the story. You count to 3, 1, 2, 3, and then you give different estimates. And if the estimates are different, you have to talk and understand why do we see it differently. A little bit, maybe we should use this more often in a vote of confidence. Just count to 3. How confident are we about this? 5. Oh, you have a 1. Well, we better talk about why. Now, the most important thing, the sixth principle of nonsense, it's empathy. Actually, and empathy is, the ability to understand what other people feel, to see things from their point of view and to imagine yourself in someone else's places. And there have been many, many studies on, the importance of nonverbal communication, Experts say that about 70 to 93% of all communication is non-verbal. Imagine that. So vocal tone, fidgeting, facial expressions, head movements, hand gestures, body posture, physical distance, all of that tells us a lot. Now, if words only stand for 7% of what we communicate, we better improve our empathy to understand the meaning of the word that the other person is saying. Remember that Star Wars scene? I didn't say Star Wars. I just hymned, and there was a picture of a ship coming. So we need to look beyond words, And most effective communication happens in front of whiteboards, where we use all our senses. This is much more effective than, for example, reading a long requirement documentation, where we might only use 7% of our communication capacity. This is all in the Agile Manifesto as well. It's one of the principles. Anyway, it's not until we discuss the requirements that we understand that we don't understand each other. So empathy is really king. Wittgenstein wrote last in Tractatus that if you read his book and understand it, then basically you understand that everything he wrote was nonsense. It's a pain, reading this very difficult book, and then it says, oh, everything I wrote was nonsense. But it says at the same time, in order to understand it was nonsense, you have to read the book. Then you can throw away the ladder, you kind of ascendant up to some higher heights of understanding, and then you don't need the ladder. He was very pretentious. Anyway, to summarize this, when Wittgenstein lived, programming was not known. Programming fits the younger Wittgenstein's theories of philosophy perfectly. It fulfills the quest that he actually never managed to accomplish, a perfect match between language and an end result. Now, the older Wittgenstein's theories fit better into dynamic teamworks and social, complicated, complex situation where there's no causality. And his theories can explain a little bit of why you can't just add more people to a team and why they can't deliver at full capacity from the start. We first need to understand each other, we need to create game rules, and we need to learn how to work together. And maybe, sometimes it's a good idea that we don't understand each other. Wittgenstein, he also said that if people never did silly things, nothing intelligent, would ever get done. So maybe, creativity is born from stupidity, mistakes, and not understanding. Inventions are usually just putting things together in a different way than it was intended. So anyway, I hope you got something out of this session, and thank you so much. And in case you think this was interesting, but tough to understand, just find me on LinkedIn. I can send you a transcript as well of this entire talk. I had a mentee as well, but actually, let's see if I got some. Nah, I didn't get so much feedback on that one. But let's see, we have about 4 minutes left, and let's see on the question and answers if there are any questions. No, if no questions, maybe I can, if maybe I can make a commercial for myself. If you are a role-playing nerd and you also like agility, maybe you would be interested in my hobby project, which is the Game Masters Framework for software. Basically, it takes role-playing and adds some principles from the Agile Manifesto into it. Yeah. Let's see. No question and answers. No. And nothing on the chat either. Thanks, Dennis, for your comment. Anyway. Oh, coffee. What can be the further reading on how philosophy can help us in developing better software? Ooh, that's a good question. Actually, if you take many of the agile gurus, they actually go all the way back to many of the philosophers. If you take Cockburn, for example, I think I have this book. I can't see it. Well, I found it now. This book, for example, is an old book, but actually, Alistair, he references Pelle, and Pelle actually got his inspiration from Wittgenstein, for example. So I think that no matter which philosophy you read about, there is always something you can take from it. If it, for example, just take the thing with the waterfall versus the agile world. Waterfall is basically based on Plato's ideas, whereas agile is based on Aristotle's ideas. Because Plato thinks there is an idea world. There are concepts, and you can't trust your senses, is basically what Plato says. So in order to understand the world, you should just close your eyes and think about how you can solve the problem. Is how we do in waterfall, right? We try to solve the problem by analyzing everything before we begin to work, whereas Aristotle said, no, that doesn't work. The only thing to find out how things are is to do practical experiments with our senses and go out and experiment. He basically, invented the scientific method. And that's what agility is based upon. So I think that any philosophy is useful as long as you see how it can be used in a different context. And that's one of the things I learned from philosophy is that any theory is useful in the right context. Theories come and go. Even Newton, his theories was very useful, but they're not true. But still, we got a lot of use from what he found out. Yeah. So that's it. I think I'll end the session now if I can. There is the end session. Okay. Anyway, thanks again. I hope you got something out of this. I know this is a very complicated subject, and you have to be a little bit of a nerd to appreciate it, I think. Thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of the day.